I'm ready. Time to start. I'd like to welcome you to this lecture on the evolution of the human race, how Aquinas can help us understand it, hosted by the Aquinas Institute. I'm Richard Conrad, the former director of the Institute, and welcome you on behalf of Father Oliver Keenan, the current director, who's at another conference this weekend. The lecture is delivered by 3 members of the Thomistic Evolution project, with which the Aquinas Institute is cooperating. They're Father Nicanor Austriaco, director of the project, who's Professor of Biology and of Theology at Providence College and at the University of Santo Tomas in Manila. Then Father Simon Gaine, who was Regent of Studies here and is now at the Angelicum as the Pankhurst Professor in Theological Anthropology and Ethics and a member of the International Theological Commission. And finally, Father Thomas Davenport, who's been Assistant Professor of Physics at Providence College and now leads the Project for Science and Religion of the Thomistic Institute at the Angelicum. Each will speak for about 15 minutes, allowing for a few questions after his talk. You can submit questions using the chat function on YouTube, and Brother Albert will kindly relay them to the speaker as time allows. Other members of the Thomistic Evolution team are in this room, with some local experts who are joining us for a workshop. And if questions from those watching remotely dry up, I'm sure the people in the room will have things to contribute. Before Father Simon starts his part of the lecture, I'd like to invite Father Nicanor to say a few words about the Thomistic Evolution project. Father Nicanor.
So thank you, Father Richard, for that kind introduction and for offering to co-sponsor this event with ThomisticEvolution.org. So Thomistic Evolution is an ongoing project that was initiated by a group of Dominican friars about 10 years ago that has now expanded to include our lay colleagues from all over the world. The challenge of this, the goal, the challenge of this project is to integrate and to bring into conversation the insights of evolutionary theory with the structural, philosophical, theological framework provided by our esteemed brother, St. Thomas Aquinas, the great Catholic philosopher and theologian of the 13th century. And so this is one of the first events that is going to highlight the work of our team. We will have a concurrent, a follow-up event in the United States at Providence College in a month, and you're invited to do that as well. That will also be broadcast live. We're not quite sure which platform it will be on at this time. And in closing, I would like to thank the John Templeton Foundation for the funding that allows us to do this work, and to thank Our Lady for her ever-present prayers. Thank you so much. And now I'd like to call Father Simon Gaine. He will go ahead and present the first of the 3 lectures.
I've been asked to begin by saying something brief about what the Catholic Church teaches, if anything, about evolution. So I begin by saying that the Catholic Church takes the position that truth cannot contradict truth, and that God is the source of both divine faith and human reason. Hence, as the First Vatican Council affirmed, there can never be any real discrepancy between faith and reason, although it may be the case that a particular interpretation of a theory wrongly based on philosophical or scientific reason is false and may be incompatible with Christian faith. So while Catholics may be obliged by their faith to reject certain versions of the theory of evolution, such as atheistic or materialistic interpretations. It is not open to them to reject a genuine delivery of scientific reason. While the Catechism of the Catholic Church repeats this positive view of the relationship between science and faith, it nevertheless makes no explicit mention of the theory of evolution. However, this is not to say that the theory of evolution, as it regards human origins, has escaped the notice of church teaching. Some of this notice involves what evolution cannot explain, and I'm thinking here of the human soul. In his encyclical of 1950, Humani Generis, Pope Pius XII taught that evolution cannot explain the appearance of the human soul. The reason for this lies in what the Church already taught about this spiritual soul. According to Catholic teaching, a human being is a unity of body and soul. Moreover, the spiritual soul is immediately created by God out of nothing in each case, rather than produced by one's parents. And this soul does not perish when it separates from the body at death. You can read a recent statement of this teaching on the soul in paragraph 366 of the Catechism. I should add that by saying the soul is immediately created by God, it is meant that God causes it to be without making use of any secondary created causes in its production. Catholic teaching seems to have approached certainty about this issue over the centuries as alternative explanations of the origin of the soul were ruled out. The idea that human souls pre-existed their bodies had been current in the time of the early Church, but it fell out of favour among Catholics and was set aside. The pre-existence of souls, together with the idea that souls originated out of God's substance, was rejected. For some time there remained uncertainty as to whether one's soul was immediately created by God or was derived from the souls of one's parents, a theory known as traducianism. By the 12th century, the question had been effectively decided in favour of immediate creation. For St. Thomas Aquinas and others, reconciling the essential immateriality of the subsistent soul with its production by a material process would be out of the question. Immediate creation of the soul was the last theory standing. And so it came to be accepted as a theological certainty and was endorsed by the Church's ordinary magisterium or teaching authority. For example, when speaking of the Immaculate Conception of Our Lady in the 17th century, Pope Alexander VII spoke of the creation of Mary's soul. What Pius XII did in 1950 was to draw the same conclusion concerning the origin of the human race, the same as counts for all instances of human reproduction. Just as the spiritual soul cannot be the product of the physical act of reproduction by human parents, so it cannot be the product of any material process of evolution. and so the Church teaches that the spiritual soul cannot be explained by any theory of evolution. However, it is different as regards the body. As I have already said, the Church teaches that a human being is a unity of soul and body. At the same time as he ruled out an evolutionary explanation of the soul, Pope Pius cautiously indicated that there was freedom to explore the possibility that the human body could be explained in such terms. He wrote that the Church's magisterium does not forbid that, in conformity with the present state of human sciences and sacred theology, research and discussions on the part of people experienced in both fields take place with regard to the doctrine of evolution, insofar as it inquires into the origin of the human body as coming from pre-existent and living matter. This gave confirmation to developments that had already been taking place for some decades in Catholic theology. Apart from the rise of evolutionary theory, Catholic theologians generally explained the origin of the first human body in the way it is described in Genesis 2, as an immediate divine act of formation. The immediacy of this divine action did not imply that this body had been created out of nothing, as was held for souls, even though this action of formation of the body was sometimes referred to as a creation. Rather, while the soul was created out of nothing, the first body was formed from pre-existing matter, as is suggested by the formation of Adam's body from the dust of the earth in the narrative of Genesis 2. What was in fact implied by the immediacy of formation was that as God made no use of secondary causes in the creation of the human soul out of nothing, so he made no use of secondary causes in the formation of Adam's body from pre-existing non-living matter. During the middle of the 20th century, this consensus broke down as theologians, conscious of the scientific consensus about evolution that had emerged, experimented with including evolution as a kind of secondary cause employed by God within their theological accounts of the origin of the first human body. While Humani Generis did not oblige theologians to do this, it certainly affirmed the freedom of theologians to continue along these lines. Something different is found, however, when we arrive at Pope St. John Paul II's words to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences in 1996. In contrast to Pius XII's more cautious words, John Paul spoke to the Academy of new knowledge that leads us toward the recognition of evolution as more than a hypothesis. What he meant by this is debated, but I take his words to mean that there is now no remaining competition within science to explain what evolution legitimately sets out to explain, and that as regards natural science on this point, Catholic theology is now dealing with evolution alone. In other words, insofar as theology draws on reason as well as from faith, it must admit the truth of the evolution of the human body. However, while this might seem to imply that immediate formation of the body, insofar as it excludes evolution, can no longer be held by theologians, there seems to have been no move by the magisterium to declare this to be the case exactly. Despite John Paul's words, the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which was first published the following year, had nothing explicit to say on this subject. I suggest that immediate formation of the body is still tolerated by the Church's magisterium, in much the same way as denial of the Immaculate Conception by the Dominicans was tolerated for a period in the 17th century, when the Church's liturgy and papal magisterium were already committed to this doctrine. Although the Church's teaching may move in one direction, it is possible for the Church to tolerate other approaches. I suggest that we can find something not entirely dissimilar in the Church's present approach to the question of whether the first human beings were a single couple, the idea known as monogenism, or were a larger group, what is known as polygenism. In Humani Generis, Pius XII indicated that the freedom extended to explaining the origin of the body did not extend to this question of number. The reason for this was that it was not evident how polygenism could be squared with Catholic teaching on original sin. Although monogenism has never been defined by the Church, as was proposed prior to both Vatican I and Vatican II, Humani Generis placed it firmly in the Church's ordinary teaching. Evolutionary theory, however, thinks in terms of the evolution of a population of some thousands rather than a single original couple. Since the time of Humani Generis, some monogenists have proposed a reconciliation between scientific data and Catholic teaching by distinguishing between a fully human original couple with immortal souls within a wider breeding population of more archaic humans. The last time the Church's magisterium explicitly affirmed monogenism was when Pope St. Paul VI endorsed it at a symposium on original sin in 1966. Some theologians, however, suggested that it could in fact be clarified how polygenism and the doctrine of original sin could indeed be compatible after all. The fact that the magisterium has said nothing explicitly on this whole question since 1966 may give the impression that the Church has withdrawn its support for monogenism. It seems to me, however, that this need not be the case, and the ordinary magisterium remains committed to monogenism, while tolerating, at least for the moment, the exploration of polygenism by theologians for the good of theological progress and exploration. Thank you very much for listening.
So I have a question, actually, with regards to, so I agree with you with your final assessment that the Church tends to side with monogenism. The International Theological Commission in in its document on the Imago Dei opens up the possibility of polygenism. How would one reconcile that account with original sin? I mean, is there so when you look at Humani Generis assumes that it's very difficult to do that. And I'm just wondering, have there advances been made in the last 60, 70 years that allow us to begin to see how we could reconcile those two? A polygenistic account with the Church's teaching kind of revealed truth on original sin.
As well as the document you mentioned, it may also be worth looking into the Pontifical Biblical Commission's document, What is Man?, which has been recently translated into English. I would say, of course, that the International Theological Commission advises the magisterium of the Church and so is not part of the Church's teaching authority as such, but it does give theological advice and has indicated the opening up of this explanation in terms of polygenism. What this means is certainly a single population. Polygenism was often used in the 19th century to speak about what today would be called the multi-regional hypothesis, that humans evolved in different parts of the world. But I think that what's being thought of here is very definitely a single population. So I think that it's a matter of exploring how there could be a way in which there would be a solidarity in sin of that entire population. It might have to involve there being a leader of the population, a kind of an alpha figure who would hold some kind of responsibility for the community as a whole, and therefore would be, I think, responsible for losing God's original blessing for that whole community. I think there might have to be some kind of considerations as to whether that leader holds out until the end, so that everyone else had already fallen in that kind of way. One difficulty still that would remain, I think, is that there would be new human beings who would come into being for a while who were not directly descended from that leader. And that's, I think, one of these kind of sticking points that Humani Generis points out. Eventually, of course, everyone in the population would be descended somehow from that leader, but there would be people who would not inherit original sin from him for a while. So although there has been work done in this area, I'm not sure it's solved everything that others think are problems for this kind of approach.
This may be more of a human anthropology question, or that is out of your expertise, but when the sort of scientific understanding of this population of 10,000, is it, I mean, when you think of 10,000 people, that's not a small number of people. Is this one like organized group, or is it disparate groups that happen to overlap, or do you have any sense of that yourself? That might be.
I don't really have any sense of that myself. I think in terms of the genetic arguments and so on, you're talking about a number of breeding couples. And they needn't necessarily all live in one place, because, I mean, there will be sufficient connection, I suppose, between different groups for this kind of solidarity in sin to take place. However, I don't know whether it's plausible to think of the one leader as able to have this kind of influence if they're not all together. So it may be that some of the polygenistic theories of original sin might work for a smaller single group. It might not be able to work for the size and dispersed nature of the original population. But it is out of my area of expertise, and I couldn't tell you the answer.
Would it be theologically possible to think that the sin is inherited not only from this first alpha male, but he leads a group of first human beings to sin, and then the sin is inherited from those who have sinned collectively, guided by this first, by the leader. So wouldn't this way of thinking about the actual sin solve the problem of the inheritance of sin?
I think you'd certainly have an account of inheritance of sin, but whether it would be inheritance of sin from Adam, that's another matter. And I think it may be the kind of objections to the polygynist view come from understand that we all inherit sin from Adam. And Adam not as the single person, the leader, rather than Adam standing for some kind of collective group. So while there may be a sense of how sin is inherited in that picture, it wouldn't necessarily be sin inherited from Adam. And that's often what is being talked about here.
Thank you.
That does presume that Adam is an individual, right? But of course the Hebrew word Adam can also just mean human being. So it would admit, I mean, it would involve some serious reinterpretation, I think, but in theory it's not, at least not totally out of the question, such an interpretation, do you think? Or is has the church committed to an individual Adam?
It seems to me that the church has to be committed to an individual Adam. I don't see any way around that, and certainly, you know, that what you say is true of the Hebrew word, but I think any fair reading of Scripture and Christian tradition sees that we are talking about an individual here. So even if you have a kind of a polygenistic account, I don't think you can take out of it the fact that there has to be this one individual who ultimately has the responsibility here and is indeed a type of Christ.
Right.
Okay.
Shall we move on?
Thank you, Simon. The Father Simon Gaine for that wonderful is to basically use his talk as a launch pad to try to explore an account of monogenism that can be reconciled with contemporary evolutionary theory. So this is the challenge that we have today for those of us who are theologians, who are working in this area. Can we provide a coherent narrative that defends a historical Adam after Darwin? As Father Simon Gaines points out, there are options for moving away from historical Adam, but this is in so many ways the consensus position of the Catholic Church. And so I would like to begin by just reviewing what we actually know with regards to genomic science with the origins of our species. This is the out of Africa model, which is in ascendancy at this moment, at this time in many ways. This is the model that most people accept. What you have here is that comparisons of modern human genomes suggest that all of us have a common origin in a small population in Africa. And it's about 200,000 to 100,000 years ago. And they dispersed from Africa about 100,000 to 60,000 years ago to populate the rest of the planet. Now, the question, of course, that we have to deal with is how many mating pairs were there about 65,000 years ago to explain the genetic diversity that we see today. And for me to illustrate this problem, I'll just use this very simple question. You know, this is daddy beagle and mommy beagle, and these are baby beagles. And the question is, does this dog pedigree make sense? Hopefully it makes sense. If I change this and add a Dalmatian to the kids, you will notice that immediately you will recognize that this cannot be true. You know that in order to explain the genetic diversity of two beagles and a Dalmatian, you must have at least two mating pairs. historically in order to explain what we see today. And so molecular biologists have done this. They've actually looked at the genetic diversity of the human population today, and they've calculated how many mating pairs must there have been 65,000 years ago to account for the genetic diversity that you see. And as Father Simon Gaine pointed out, the 7 billion human beings today, in order to explain the genetic diversity that you see amongst us, there's a minimum of 1,000 to 2,000 mating pairs in a small geographic area in Africa. And so now the question is, how can we reconcile the Church's teaching on the historicity of Adam with the scientific findings that I've just described? And I'm going to propose that we can still do that. We can still defend a historical Adam after Darwin. And I'm going to do it in the following way. So I'm going to ask this question: when did you appear in human evolution? I think a lot of people tend to start in the past, going forward. I'd like to look at the present and go backward. And I'm going to ask, when did you appear in evolution? When would you have recognized one of these hominin ancestors as someone belonging to the category of me, us? And so we have to ask the question, what are we? What are you? And the classical account will talk about a rational creature capable of abstract thought. And so I need to review, in many ways, for those in the audience who are not that familiar with abstraction, it allows us to conceive of a single concrete individual using numerous universal concepts. And I do it this way. If I asked, what is this? You could actually give me many answers. You can say it's a thing, it's a gadget, it's a cell phone, it's an iPhone. Each one of these terms corresponds to a universal concept in the mind that is actually abstracted from this individual thing. And so this capacity, this power, is what distinguishes us from all of the other visible creatures in creation right there at this time. And so the question, if you want to ask, when did we appear, can be also reduced to this question: when did abstraction first appear in evolutionary history? And I'm going to defend the proposal that abstraction and the capacity for hierarchical language appear in evolutionary history simultaneously. Now, when I teach this in my classroom at Providence College, a lot of students will point out that animals have language as well. And so I have to distinguish between hierarchical language, which is thought to be unique to our species, and the other vocal communication systems that are out there. And so I have to explain what exactly is a hierarchical language. So I'm going to begin this way. I'm going to say that abstraction is necessary for hierarchical language. And so to illustrate what hierarchical language is, I ask, what does this sentence mean? Matt is too angry to eat. Now, if you were looking at this in a linear way, which is what all the other animal vocal communication systems are like. They're linear, they go A, B, C, D, and E. A sequence of sounds corresponds to a single meaning understood in a very generic way. But because human beings have a capacity for hierarchical language, this sequence of words can actually be grouped together in different ways hierarchically to give rise to two different meanings. So what does this sentence mean? The first meaning, Matt is too angry to eat, is Matt is too angry that he cannot eat. This is meaning number one, depending upon how you cluster these words together. But the second one is Matt is too angry to eat. Matt is too angry that I cannot eat him. And this is a second meaning in the English language. So what ends up happening is you have the same material sentence with two meanings, two forms. And so you can see how in terms of abstraction, right, abstraction allows us to understand the multiple meanings of a single sentence. In the same way that you can look at an iPhone and you can abstract different universal concepts, you can take a single English sentence, and this happens in all the languages of our species. You can take a single sentence and you can abstract different meanings. Now, linguists will look at this hierarchically. If you're a philosopher in the Aristotelian tradition, you can look at this as abstraction in a very specific sense. And it's necessary for hierarchical language. Now, I'm also positing that actually that hierarchical language is necessary for abstraction. The opposite is also true. So not only do you need abstraction for hierarchical language, I'm positing that you need hierarchical language for abstraction. And to illustrate this, I ask you, what is this? Now, for those of us who enjoy this, this is, you can look at it. Now, again, you can begin to abstract different universal concepts. It's a thing, it's an object, it's a fruit, it is a rambutan, which is very delicious in Southeast Asia. Now, one of the things that's really interesting is that this process of abstraction involves language when we talk to ourselves. So if you present this fruit to one of my students who's never seen it before, they'll either talk to someone else, they'll say, what is that? And is that a fruit? Otherwise, if they start talking to themselves, they're going to go through an interior dialogue with themselves where they're trying to figure out, and this is the thing, it allows us to distinguish and to specify universals during the process of abstraction. There are so many universals associated with this one substance that you have to figure out which universal you're going to be specifying. And you do this, and Aquinas has a very detailed account of this, by sorting accidental qualities and distinguishing them from substantial ones. And so you have to identify, this is the specific difference that specifies this thing as a thing of a particular kind. And so trying to figure out which of these qualities specify and which don't I'm proposing, actually requires language. You have to talk to yourself in order to do that. So so I say we are rational animals because we are speaking primates, and both of these are Aristotelian designators. But if this is the case, and I'm just going to refer to the research of Noam Chomsky, who's considered the father of contemporary linguistics. He posits that somewhere in that group, so this is the group that we are talking about, the group of 1,000 to 2,000 mating pairs over a small population, a small geographical area. Somewhere in that group, some small mutation took place leading to the great leap forward. It had to have happened in a single person. And what he's describing here is he proposes that there must have been a mutation that arose over the evolution of our species that altered our brain structure in a way that gave us the capacity for hierarchical language. And he posits that this happened in a single individual. So based on putting all of this together, I'm proposing the following model. So hominins is the class of ancient pre-human, human-like creatures. Hominins evolved into archaic humans that are anatomically modern about 200,000 to 100,000 years ago. What I mean here is that if you visited Africa 200,000 years ago, you would have seen creatures that looked like us. They're anatomically modern. However, what you would have noticed is that you would not have been able to communicate with them. At a single moment in time, sometime between 200,000 and 80,000 years ago, God will infuse into an individual hominin a spiritual soul after he evolves, and I mean here his body has evolved, the capacity for, the neurological capacity for language. And so this would have given this individual not only the capacity for language, but also the capacity for abstract thought. And again, so philosophically we would say the matter is now apt to receive a rational soul. Now this individual becomes a rational animal in the state of original justice. I'm referring here to the Church's teaching on the fall. This individual will fall in a way that I don't have a chance to get into, but his descendants would have migrated out of Africa to populate Gaul. Now, since all of us can speak, we have not yet been able to identify an individual who does not have that inherent capacity for language. All of us had to have been descended from this individual because this individual, the mutation that gave rise to this individual would have been one of those mutations that doesn't happen once every 100, 200,000 years. It's one of those very rare ones. And the idea is that since all of us speak, all of us have that capacity. We must have in some way been descended from this individual. So thank you very much. That's kind of like a summary of the work that I've been doing as a member of Thomistic Evolution. Any questions? Yes, Father Isaac.
That it had to have happened in just one individual.
I'll reduce his argument to the following. There's no such thing as half of English. English is an entire system. So from an evolutionary perspective, it could not have been done in a stepwise form. You couldn't have had a gradual mutation, a gradual change in the human brain such that I would understand a third of English, then 2/3, and a full. So he's positing that there was this one capacity, which he calls merge, and I have no time to get into that, which allows us in many ways to shuffle the combinations of words in a sentence that allows us to give rise to hierarchical language. And he says this capacity, which is at the root of hierarchical language, had to have appeared and had to have appeared in one person because you don't have half merge. So, and in biology, when we think about the introduction of one capacity, we usually think about a mutation of some sort. So it could have been, so people will say, well, could there not have been multiple mutations that prepared the brain for this? Absolutely. You could have had multiple mutations that lead up to it, but there's that one point where all that preparation in a way comes to full fruition, and the brain is now apt to perform this capacity called merge that allows us to shift words in one sentence back and forth so that different groupings give rise to different meanings.
Could I ask a follow-up?
Yeah.
I mean, are there other examples of mutations that like begin in one individual of the species? Something analogous to what Chomsky has in mind, and it doesn't even have to be a human being. I'm just curious.
So there are mutations. So we have accounts of mutations in evolution that give rise to single changes that
begin with one individual of a species,
right?
Human or otherwise.
So for example, even in COVID, right? So there are individuals who appear to be resistant to certain forms of COVID. Whether or not they arose in one individual is still being discussed, but that is one of the options that are available to people. So it's not unusual that a single trait appears in one. So albinism, for example, right? So if you, someone who's an albino with a single mutation, and then his children become, let me just point out, this is disputed because really no one really understands how to describe language from a biological perspective. Yes, Father?
I think we do have to agree with Chomsky that there is some kind of single, if you like, final mutation that has a significant effect on brain structure, or in some ways makes the hierarchical language and abstraction possible, so that the body is fit for the infusion of a rational soul. But some mutations that can have a significant effect, perhaps because they affect one gene that controls other genes, could emerge, obviously in one individual, but in a recessive form, because most chromosomes are in pairs. So you have 2 copies of a gene, and if, as might happen, the significant change is recessive, then it can spread through a population without being expressed until there are enough individuals with one copy of the changed gene to breed together, and suddenly around the same time you have several individuals born with 2 copies of the changed gene, and then the change appears. And that might explain how the adaptation of the brain that makes language of our kind possible could appear among several individuals around the same time, who become able to talk to each other. So although the mutation might appear in one individual, it's not expressed to produce a change of nature until there are, in fact, several individuals among whom there are two copies of the mutated gene. And that might give you several original humans who might then form a coherent group, among which there might be one as leader.
Certainly. The other option, I think the one that Chomsky actually favors, is a gain of function mutation. So COVID-19, there's been a lot of discussion about gain of functions in the SARS-CoV-2 genome. These are incredibly rare mutations that are dominant, and when they appear, the individual actually is able to manifest that capacity immediately. And I've not gotten into the discussion about Adam and Eve and how do you have a pair, but these are the kind of questions that I think will be raised when we start discussing which would be more favorable, a dominant-driven change or one that is recessive. But that's one of those questions that hopefully will bear fruit in the future. So yes?
So I would like to refer to let's say, philosophical and theological terminology that you use in your model. You speak about the human soul being infused into the hominin. Well, a hominin has a soul, I understand, an animal soul. So what happens is...
So I'm assuming this will happen at conception.
Okay.
So what happens is you have two hominins who conceive basically of the first human.
Yeah, so,
Right, you're correct. So I do not mean, that's correct. The infusion happens, I'm positing here, the infusion at conception where the embryonic organism has that capacity now because of some mutation.
yeah, and can I get just one more question? So in the model that Father Simon Gaine referred to, which was proposed by Kenneth earlier by Alexander Miller. So, from what I understand, what they would call a philosophical human being would already be rational for them, and then what comes in what they call theological human being is only reference to divine, to God, and understanding of the final end of human life. So, how would you? I mean, do you think those two models can somehow be reconciled, or yours is different?
So when I've talked to them, Kenneth Kemp at the University of St. Thomas, I believe in Minneapolis, when we've met at meetings, one of the things he points out when we discuss this is that the model that I'm presenting is trying to engage directly with the biology. Mm-hmm. While those other models are taking the biology and in many ways saying, if this biology was true within this biological context, can we identify parameters that would allow us to look at philosophical and theological humans? And so there's just different ways of looking at it. I mean, he will not talk about, so when I ask, so what distinguishes the philosophical and theological human, it's not going to be traced to a biological event. While here, it's being traced to a biological event. The human brain itself is actually being altered, so the matter is now apt to be infused by a rational soul. So thank you so much.
All right. So I will perhaps avoid the obvious ugly American British pun and just say that we're moving in a just slightly different direction with this talk. We've heard from a more sort of the theological and philosophical conversation about how do we reconcile these very complex questions. But there's a third part of what is going on in the Thomistic Evolution Project that is aimed at finding ways to take these reflections and make them accessible as broadly as possible. The original Thomistic Evolution Project was aimed in many ways at sort of a college-educated average Catholic in the pew. But as we know, many of these questions about faith and science and evolution in particular start to become problems for people much younger. And so there's a portion of this project which is focusing on adapting this work of Thomistic evolution for high school students to be taught in Catholic high schools and in Catholic homes. This project is in conjunction with a team of Dominicans. I'll mention a little bit, but in particular I want to mention Sister Stephen Patrick and Sister Mary Elizabeth of the Dominican Sisters of Mary Mother of the Eucharist, who are both themselves. Sister Stephen Patrick has a doctorate in biology, Sister Mary Elizabeth in engineering, but also teach in high schools, in Catholic high schools run by their Dominican sisters, and have been hugely instrumental in this project. Perhaps I don't need to argue for this, but why is it important to discuss faith and science, and particularly these questions around evolution in high school? But these are just two quotes that Sister Mary Elizabeth brought up from her own students, high school sophomores. The relationship between faith and science is kind of a tightrope to walk. God gave us this beautiful world, and it should be our pleasure and duty to explore all that he gave us through science. So these are students being educated in a Catholic school, and you would think hopefully they would have a nice and robust vision of what of how to balance Catholic faith and science. But even here, there's a worry and a confusion and difficulty. And if we look to the broader population, it's much worse. There's lots of surveys on this. I'm just going to reference a few basic points just to set the stage. So this is just a general interviews of U.S. Catholics. 60% agree that there are unresolvable conflicts between science and religion. This is among adult Catholics in the United States. 60% believe that human origins, including evolution, also believe this is incompatible with church teaching, and just under 2/3 do not agree that science needs religion to understand complete truth. If we look specifically to young people, this is a study specifically looking at the rise of atheism among high school age students. This is just 13 to 18-year-olds. 30%, I have a hard time believing a good God would allow so much evil. 20% says science refutes much of the Bible. I don't believe in fairy tales. All sorts of different reasons that that are brought forward. And looking at these same students who have a Christian background but no longer believe, one of the 6 major reasons for leaving has to do with science. The church is out of step with scientific world we live in. Church is anti-science. And among even church-going teens, 50% still say the church seems to reject much of what science tells us about the world. So this is clearly a hugely important problem. So how is it that we can try to use the work that we're doing with Thomistic evolution to try and provide resources and help in this project? So the idea is to take the general structure that the ideas that began with the first phase of Thomistic evolution, but also as much as possible to incorporate the great work that's continuing in these newer steps, and taking the philosophical and theological tradition of St. Thomas, but show how it can engage with questions around contemporary biology, in particular the theory of evolution, while taking seriously the Catholic Church's understanding of the scripture and tradition that found our faith. Now, this portion of the team is a group of Dominicans. So in addition to the Dominican sisters, I mentioned a number of Dominican friars from Providence College, from the Dominican House of Studies in Washington, D.C., have worked on this to help adapt these general ideas to hopefully a coherent presentation that is accessible to high school students. The goals of the project are twofold. One is focused on the students, to figure out a way, or to craft these things in a way that communicates the key concepts clearly at the level accessible to a high school student. That appropriate level of understanding, but also opening them up to the richness of the philosophical and theological tradition of the church. And incorporate and adapt for the various learning styles that students present, and create a forum for which they can have open and thoughtful conversations about faith and science. Now, this is a great notion and a great idea of if we could get direct access to high school students and try to engage them in that way. But how is it that we're actually going to engage with students? Most likely through their teachers and their parents. And so we need to make the resources accessible and adaptable to them as well. And so the project is aimed to be easy to pick up and implement. We're not we're not designing an entire course. We're not designing a new biology course or a new theology course. We're designing materials that can be integrated into already existing theology and biology courses by high school teachers, or picked up by parents and others to supplement what their children are receiving at school. So the idea is to be complete and yet flexible, to be a standalone product, a standalone conversation that can be broken up into pieces and used as appropriately as the individual teachers who, as you will learn if you spend time with high school teachers like these Dominican sisters, already have a lot on their plate in terms of their workload and what they're fitting into their classroom. So how can we make it as easy and accessible for these teachers who want to engage in these questions but don't necessarily know how to do it themselves? How can we help them and give them the resources they need to be confident in teaching this to their students? And as part of that, then, in addition to the idea that it would be an adaptable system, is to figure out ways to help educate the educators through projects in the actual schools, to introduce the teachers in different workshops, help them to gain the confidence in the material so that they feel like they can present it to their students clearly and answer their questions. I apologize if this slide is a little hard to read. The coloring didn't come off quite as right. The idea here then is to have a series of modules, is what we're calling them, broken up into two tracks, one in theology, one in biology, and broken up into sort of 5 steps in each module having 3 basically roughly 1-page front and back handout that can be just given to the students with covering a particular topic. And while there's a separate theology track and a separate biology track, the idea is that they will reference back to one another. And so that concepts that come up in theology can be expanded upon in biology and vice versa. That will introduce some of the philosophical and theological themes in the biology section and introduce some of the biological themes in the theology section as well. If you could read this, you might be able to see that there's a sort of pairing up of the topics. It begins in theology with questions around reason and faith in general, whereas in biology it's focusing on the question of science and faith. And even the questions parallel. We begin with what is theology, and on the other side, what is science? Theology and reason paired with science and reason, and theology and faith compared with science and faith. And even in the writing of these, we're trying to find ways to link these things together so that there's not just biology students learning about biology and theology students learning about theology and theology, but seeing how these topics can and should interweave and interlock. And the hope is that through going through these various modules, it can be a fairly complete presentation of the general Catholic understanding of how to approach the question of evolution and a general explanation of the best science of evolution. At a level that may not address all of the details that have come up even today and will come up tomorrow, but at least open up to the possibility of those questions and presents a coherent picture of how to imagine and think about the origin of the human person from both a scientific and a theological perspective. So each module will be broken up into, again, these 3 main topics, sort of 3 handouts, which will have a reading for the students, we'll have discussion questions for the teacher to lead, different sorts of activities, POGLs, this is a term from high school education apparently, but it's a tool for interacting with students and getting them to kind of self-led interactions, and a guide for the teachers to help them and give them further resources to reach out for different questions. So right now the texts are all in draft status. We've sort of starting from the top down. The first 2 modules in both sides are in a fairly complete draft form and fairly extensive drafts, but need to be cleaned up for the others. And we've started piloting a few of these in individual high school classrooms, and we're hoping to perhaps by the end of this school year or next year have a fuller pilot program to begin using these in some of these Catholic high schools with interested teachers. We've commissioned artists and layout designers to help make this a very professional and presentable tool, and design various sort of posters and resources for classrooms as well. The website is a little bit sparse at the moment, but we're hoping to continue to add more information on the website about how this will be accessible. The idea being that it will be both published as a physical book if needed, but also PDFs available online for teachers. More detail what we're hoping to cover in each of those modules. We'll hopefully, it's not on there yet, but we'll hopefully put that up on the website soon so you can get a general sense of just the detail that we're trying to get in and the level that we're trying to address these questions at. So I'll stop there and just see if there are any questions for about the high school portion of this project.
I mean, I don't know if this is relevant or not, but my impression is that the percentage of people who think that there needs to be a conflict between faith and science, they think not only in terms of actual science, but oftentimes I think they think about technology and the way science is being used, and these are rather moral issues that they have problems with. So do you address or plan to address this at all in this entire project?
That is, as of now, that is not in our plan.
Yeah,
right now the plan is to focus simply on the question of biological evolution and the philosophical, theological, and biological questions around it. This is, you're right, this is far from the only question in issues around faith and science, but it is, I think, a important one and a core one. I think it underlies, at least from one of my experience, particularly in the United States, much of the tension that you find in Christians and Catholics in thinking about faith and science. Often the first thing they think of is evolution. Later they might get into some of the moral questions, they might get into some other things, but it's sort of, this is where it starts. And it's also, I think, important to recognize that, and this is something I didn't realize until getting to know some of these high school teachers, it starts early. I mean, even high school teachers who are teaching freshmen are talking about freshmen who are coming in. So we're ninth graders, 12, 13 years old, who already are convinced that there's conflict between science and religion. So it's and you also find very earnest high school teachers who, very good theology teachers and very good biology teachers who want to present good material but don't feel confident in both sides of the conversation. Biology teachers who may not feel like they understand the philosophy and theology enough to, they think they understand enough to reconcile it for themselves, but when questions start coming, it becomes difficult. And the same thing on the theology side, where they think they understand it, but when a smart science student starts poking them with questions, they get uncomfortable. So finding ways to help the teachers be confident and reasonable expressors of the idea.
I think I'd like to add to that. So we actually there's a grant proposal in progress to propose an online internet encyclopedia of Catholic bioethics that we're working on.
Some questions have come in for the previous speakers. So if there's nothing more on the catechetical side.
Well, there's one short question. From personal experience, I think what's very important when you go to schools and talk about science and religion is the personal dimension. So students at the end of your talk start asking the question, well, what do you actually believe? So is this just something you tell us, or do you actually are committed to these things? So do you at all include these more kind of personal questions that you actually have a role model in class?
I think in two ways. I think we're trying to attempt to do that. One is through, again, the resources for which the teachers can take the time, and also the hope is to actually have not just resources for them to find on their own, but also sort of in-service sorts of projects where we can go into the classroom, give them credit and time to learn this, to give them the confidence. Because I think many of them want to be that role model, but might not have the confidence in it, or feel like they get worried about it. The other side is, which I didn't express as clearly, but in certain sort of breakout boxes and sort of things, we are trying to reference broader Catholic scientists who have been involved in these questions and topics too. So point out other role models outside of the class as well that show the coherence of faith and science. So that is an aspect of it that we are trying to build up as well. So thank you for your question.
There is a question for Father Thomas from YouTube.
Yes.
How accessible and doable are these modules for homeschooling?
So absolutely, I'd say yes. So our hope is that they would be just as accessible for homeschool as they would be for the high school. If we're talking about a high school homeschooler, then whoever is leading their classes in biology and theology, these sorts of modules should be just as accessible for them to both as an educator and as a student. So that is absolutely something we have in mind to make this a resource for homeschoolers as well. Absolutely.
Maybe we could move to Father Simon, if you'd like to resume the microphone. So the question that came in was, might the relationship between Adam and the group be akin to the relationship between the kings of Israel and the nation, with Adam representing the whole and influencing the moral and spiritual culture of the whole?
I think there's certainly an analogy to be drawn there, and I think it's, without doubt, you can make that kind of comparison. I'm not sure whether it can help us find solutions to the particular questions and challenges that are involved in reconciling the doctrine of original sin with a large community. So there may be some analogy to be drawn, but I'm not sure what results we can get from that to help with these particular questions. I'd have to give it some more thought.
One thing occurs to me, which is that in one of his papers, I think it was 1968, Rahner suggested that the essence of the doctrine of original sin is that our reception of human nature from the original population was meant to be the basis and medium of the reception of grace, and the sin in the first group made human nature unfit for that purpose. So when we receive human nature, it isn't with grace, but grace comes through Christ instead. And that would take the original group as Adam. But the modification suggested here, that there is a leader like the King of Israel, would preserve both the possibility of inheriting human nature from a fairly large original group, but the existence of a single Adam who's the type of Christ. So might a combination of the two be of some use, do you think?
It may be of some use, where I'm not sure what it would help with, though, in the question of there being human beings who inherit original sin, but aren't descended from Adam. And I think that is a question that we really need to come to terms with, both in terms of the role we find for Adam in Scripture, but also in tradition and teachings of councils of the church, like Trent. So I'm not sure that, I'm sure this can do something. I'm not sure that it can answer to some of the questions that were raised earlier on.
Thank you. And then there's a question for Father Nicanor.
You've been picked up by this.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
So the question is, doesn't Chomsky's hypothesis provide an evolutionary account of rationality? So can you explain what addition the infusion of the soul would provide if rationality happens by an evolutionary jump? Why do you need the infusion of the soul?
So from a biological perspective, and biology is looking primarily as at the evolution of the matter. Chomsky is correct. His account would provide, would explain why at a certain point in time, individuals before this point were not rational, and individuals after this point would be rational. However, from a philosophical perspective, we would have to explain that even further, because it's not just a matter of matter. So the current scientific paradigm reduces everything to matter. From a philosophical perspective, especially a hylomorphic one coming from the Aristotelian tradition, we would have to explain not only the evolution of the matter, but also the nature, the capacities of the organism that came to be. And since the rationality here, and again, this is an argument that I would not be able to get into at this point, rationality understood in this way would require foundations in an immaterial substrate, then we would have to speak about a form, a soul that was immaterial in nature, rather than all the forms that pre-exist, all of the other organisms that were pre-existing that particular individual, which could have a material form. So again, they're not necessarily opposed, they're just two different ways of understanding the same reality. One that is biological through and through, simply talking about matter, while the other one, the account that I'm proposing is much more holistic. It looks not just at the brain, but also looks at the capacity and how this capacity has to be spiritual in nature in order for abstraction to really happen. So thank you. So I'm going to take this time to thank the audience for being with us today at this inaugural Thomistic Evolution Aquinas Institute co-sponsored event. And we invite you for the American version of this event, which will happen on November 13th at Providence College. We've still not yet published all the appropriate links, but we can forward it to the Aquinas Institute so that the Aquinas Institute can forward it to its own mailing lists and email lists for those of you who may be interested. Just Google us if you have any questions, and that our ThomisticEvolution.org website actually has a contact form. So if you would like any other information, especially the ongoing work that Father Thomas and our two Dominican sisters are working on in earnest, which is the development of a high school curriculum that will inform faith and reason in this conversation between evolution and creation, please let us know. We're always, especially if you're a homeschooling family, we're always looking for people who might be willing to trial our modules on the way to perfection. Thank you very much, and God bless you.